October 25, 1944. The Pacific Ocean. A young man climbs into the cockpit of a Zero fighter. He is 22 years old. He has a photograph of his mother folded inside his flight suit. In his pocket, a letter he spent 3 days writing and will never send himself. He checks the instruments. He adjusts his white headband. He does not look back at the runway. He will be dead in 40 minutes. His name was Kiyoshi Ogawa, and the last thing he ever wrote was not a war cry. It was not a declaration of loyalty to the emperor. It was an apology to his parents for dying before he could make them proud. Between 1944 and 1945, thousands of young men exactly like him were loaded into aircraft, pointed at American warships, and told that dying was an honor. The world called them Kamikazes. Japan called them the Special Attack Units. Their commanders called them Divine Wind. Their letters called them something else entirely. Sons, brothers, students, men who were afraid and said so in writing, in words that were censored, hidden, coded, and sometimes simply crossed out and written again, because there was no other way to say goodbye. For 80 years, the story told about these men was simple: fanatics, brainwashed, in love with death. The letters say otherwise, and for 80 years, almost nobody read them. To understand those letters, you have to understand the corner Japan had painted itself into by the fall of 1944. The war in the Pacific was already lost. Japan's military commanders knew it. Their pilots knew it. The math was impossible to argue with. In June of 1944, during what American sailors nicknamed the Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan lost over 600 aircraft in 2 days. The United States lost 29. That ratio, 600 to 29, was not a battle. It was an execution. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. The remaining carriers had so few planes left, they were being used as floating decoys. Enormous ships sailing in formation with empty decks, existing only to draw American fire away from ships that still had something to fight with. The planes were gone, and the men who knew how to fly them were gone with them. Japan's pre-war training system had produced genuinely excellent pilots, but it took 2 years to build one. There was no rotation system, no effective search and rescue. Every mission reduced an already shrinking pool of experienced men with no way to replace them. America was producing 8,000 new pilots per month, each one with over 500 hours of flight time. Japan's replacement pilots were arriving at bases with fewer than 100 hours, some by the end with fewer than 20. Hiroshi Kato was one of them, 19 years old, a former engineering student from Osaka. He had been flying for 11 weeks when he was assigned to a combat unit. He wrote to his younger sister the night before his first mission. He told her he still did not fully understand how to read the fuel gauge under pressure. He told her not to tell their mother. He was not an exception. He was the rule. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi arrived in the Philippines in October 1944 and looked at what remained of his Air Force. 41 semi-functional planes, pilots who could barely fly solo, and the cold arithmetic of conventional attack. For every 18 planes Japan sent against American ships, 1 scored a hit. 18 planes destroyed for a single damaged vessel. He ran different numbers. If a pilot was not trying to drop a bomb and escape, if the pilot himself was the weapon, the hit rate climbed from under 3% to 25%. Nearly 10 times more effective. The logic was brutal. The conclusion was simple. He called for volunteers, and here's where the story history told for 80 years begins to crack open. The official record says the Kamikaze pilots volunteered, that they stepped forward freely, driven by love of country and loyalty to the emperor. The truth is documented in survivor testimony, in private letters, in diaries that were never meant to be read by anyone outside the family. The selection process worked like this. Pilots were brought into a room. An officer delivered a long speech about patriotism and sacred duty. Then a form was placed in front of each man. 3 options. I passionately wish to join. I wish to join. I do not wish to join. The form required a signature, your real name. The room was full of your commanding officers, full of the men you had trained beside for months, men whose opinion of you would follow you and your family for the rest of your lives. Decades later, when historians finally counted, the number was staggering. 1%. That is the estimated proportion of kamikaze pilots who genuinely, freely volunteered. 1%. Everyone else was coerced in one way or another. Commanders publicly humiliated men who hesitated. Families were threatened with social disgrace. Those who checked the 3rd box sometimes found their names on the list anyway. Kuroda Kanjiro never checked any box. He simply found his name among the volunteers the following morning. No explanation was ever given. Osamu Yamada, one of the few who survived because the war ended before his mission came, estimated that at least 30% of his fellow pilots privately questioned why they had to become human missiles. But in a culture where shame could destroy not just a man, but his entire family across generations, silence was the only rational response. The physical training was systematic brutality. Surviving pilots described being punched in the face so many times they stopped recognizing themselves in mirrors. Hirakawa Daikichi, a student recruited from Tokyo University, recalled a single session in which a superior officer struck him 20 times across the face. His teeth cut the inside of his mouth. He swallowed blood and said nothing. In the middle of winter, recruits were forced to sit on concrete floors for 7 hours at a time. The first skill taught was not how to aim at a target. The first skill taught was how to end your own life if capture became imminent. Rifle under the chin, trigger pulled with the toe, practiced until it was mechanical. Because surrender was never offered as an option. It had never existed in the training manual. It had never existed in the culture. And so 6,000 young men, most of them between 17 and 26, most of them former university students, the youngest confirmed at 16 years old, signed their names on a form with 3 options and reported for duty. The night before a mission, there was a ceremony. Pilots received the best food available: white rice, fish, sweet bean paste, things that had become rare in wartime Japan. They were given sake, cold, in ceremonial cups, passed from hand to hand in silence. They tied white headbands around their foreheads. The hachimaki, the same cloth warriors had worn for centuries before them. Some carried a senenbari, a belt sewn with 1,000 individual stitches, each stitch placed by a different woman, meant to carry 1,000 prayers into the final dive. They were given a few hours to do whatever they needed to do. What they did with those hours was not what the official propaganda described. Some destroyed furniture. Some sat completely still and stared at the wall for the entire night. Some wept openly in the middle of the ceremonies, calling out for their mothers, behavior that commanders officially described as the natural emotional expression of a pure warrior spirit, and that everyone in the room understood as exactly what it was. Workers who cleaned the barracks after pilots departed for their final missions reported the same thing. Room after room, mission after mission. The bedding was soaked with tears. One documented account describes a pilot who could not stand when it was time to walk to his aircraft. His legs had simply stopped working. Two fellow pilots took him by the arms and carried him to the runway. They helped him into the cockpit. They strapped him in. He taxied forward and did not look back. Some pilots spent their last hours reading aloud to each other. Not military verse, not imperial proclamations. Old Chinese poetry about autumn leaves and rivers and the specific ache of leaving people behind. They read those poems because the words said what their own letters could not, because in someone else's grief from 1,000 years ago, they found a shape for their own. That is not what fanatics do on the last night of their lives. At dawn, they dressed in their flight suits. They drank a final cup of sake. Some sent a lock of hair and a clipping of fingernails home in a small envelope, the traditional substitutes for a body that would not be recovered. Then they walked to their planes, and most of them went. Most of them sat down, adjusted their instruments, and pointed themselves at the horizon. Because months earlier, in a room full of people who knew their names, they had signed a form, and the form had said they wanted this. Before they left, they wrote letters. The letters were officially censored. Pilots knew this. So many of them developed workarounds, entrusting letters to friends for private delivery, hiding messages inside annotated books, writing in private codes that only the people who loved them would understand. The Chiron Peace Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture holds photographs of all 1,036 Army Special Attack Corps pilots who died, along with roughly 5,000 personal objects, letters, poems, photographs. One pilot's cockpit contained a small baby doll belonging to his infant daughter. He had asked his wife to send it so that something of hers would be with him at the end. Second Lieutenant Ryoji Uehara was 22 years old, a philosophy student before conscription. In his final letter, he wrote that dictatorships, even ones that appear powerful and inevitable, cannot last forever. It was the closest thing to open dissent in the entire archive, written by a man who knew no one with authority would read it until after he was gone. He also concealed a love confession inside his marked-up books, hidden in a private code addressed to a woman named Kyoko-chan. The words he could not say in a censored letter, left where he hoped she would someday find them. Corporal Yukio Araki was 17 years old, the youngest confirmed Kamikaze pilot in the Army archive. He wrote to his younger brothers. He told them to study hard, to eat properly, to look after their parents. He did not mention the emperor. He did not mention Japan's divine mission or the sacred wind or the honor of sacrifice. He wrote like what he was, an older brother worried about the people he was leaving behind. Captain Adachi Takuya was 23. His parents had made an extraordinary journey to see him one final time before his mission. In his letter afterward, he wrote about the moment his mother took his hand, about the sushi she had prepared and carried all that distance. Quote, "It was the most delicious meal of my life. Washed with my tears, End quote. He did not write about victory. He wrote about his mother's hands and what it felt like when she let go. Ichizo Hayashi was 22. His letter to his mother is one of the most studied in the archive. Partway through, he wrote a single sentence, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. Quote, "I cannot help crying when I think of you, Mama. Please forgive me." End quote. He crossed it out because it was not what a warrior was supposed to feel. He wrote it again because it was true. A pilot named Yoshitaro from Shizuoka Prefecture wrote to his older brother 3 days before his death. He asked his brother to care for their mother in the coming winter. He mentioned a bar of soap he had left among his belongings, a small gift from his commanding officer, and asked that someone make use of it. A bar of soap, written about in a letter composed 3 days before dying, because it seemed wasteful to leave it unused. When historians studied the complete archive in the decades after the war, they found references to approximately 1,400 different books in the pilot's letters and personal diaries. Descartes, the New Testament, Japanese classical poetry, Western philosophy, novels, scientific texts. References to the emperor appeared rarely. References to their enemies appeared almost not at all. What they wrote about, with overwhelming consistency across thousands of letters from thousands of different men, was the people they were leaving behind, the specific weight of a mother's hand, the sound of a younger brother's voice, the particular smell of a hometown they knew they would never see again. These were not the documents of fanatics. They were the documents of people who had been told they had chosen something they had not chosen, written in the hours before a death they could not escape. Kiyoshi Ogawa struck the USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945. He was the second pilot to hit the ship within 30 seconds of the first. The combined impact ignited aviation fuel stored below deck. The fires burned for hours. 393 men died. 264 more were wounded. The Bunker Hill was removed from combat for the remainder of the war. Ogawa was 22 years old. His letter reached his parents after his death. They kept it for the rest of their lives. In total, approximately 6,000 young men flew kamikaze missions. Nearly 4,000 died. They sank 47 Allied ships and damaged over 350 more. They killed roughly 5,000 Allied sailors. They did not change the outcome of the war. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Vice Admiral Onishi, the man who created the program, who stood before young men and told them their deaths would save their country, performed ritual suicide the morning after the surrender. He chose a method that took 13 hours to kill him. He refused a mercy strike. He had sent thousands of boys to die with honor. He did not extend himself the same courtesy. The pilots who survived, those whose missions were aborted by mechanical failure, by weather, by the war ending before their number was called, came home to a Japan that did not know what to do with them. The Allied occupation reframed the kamikaze program as mass fanaticism. The pilots were portrayed as brainwashed zealots who had loved death. Many could not find employment. Some were denied admission to universities. A specific term emerged for their condition, the special attack syndrome. The inability to re-enter normal life after spending months waiting in an organized line for your own death. One survivor, Castor Odati, kept his history secret for 60 years. even from his wife. In 2016, at the age of 91, he published a memoir. Quote, "There was not a single person among us who had decided to die of his own free will. Every one of our lives was thrown away by the people who held power over us." End quote. The Chiron Peace Museum still stands in southern Japan. Visitors consistently report finding it impossible to leave without crying. Not because of the aircraft on display, not because of the statistics on the walls, because of the letters, because of the baby doll in the cockpit, because of the photograph of Corporal Yukio Araki, 17 years old, holding a puppy, smiling directly at the camera, taken the afternoon before he died. The letters are still there, in glass cases, in a museum anyone can visit, written by boys who were told they had volunteered, to people who spent the rest of their lives wondering if they could have done something to bring them home. No tribunal was ever convened for what was done to them. No commander was ever charged. The form with 3 options was never investigated as a crime. It was called war. This is the Last Witness Files. Every story has a last witness. Today, you are one of them.